Matthew 5:14-16 says, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." The last thing that we were talking about before this is salt, in the verses that precede this. Salt and light go hand in hand. Those two things represent similar but slightly different elements that have to be present both within the church, here among us, in our interactions with each other, as well as working out from us to the world. Salt and light ought to be here among us, where we experience that ourselves. But really, the salt and light in these passages, and I've been kind of beating this drum about the necessity of what we're doing, reaching outside the church, and that everything just isn't insulated. It's intended to be a little more extroverted, so to speak, in terms of our evangelism. But salt and light in Jesus' statements here referring to those things. Though they are beneficial to us in the church among one another, for us to have salt between each other, light, we're sharing. Really, when Jesus is talking about these things, he's talking about something that is for the sake of the world. That's why he says you're the light of the world. You notice he doesn't say you're the light of the church, or you're the light of God's people, or you're the light of the kingdom. You're the light of the world, which means the world is who needs the light the most. And the salt was in the same kind of a context. This again reinforces, though, that though we might need to be light to one another as believers, there has to be light inside the church. I wouldn't argue that for a second. That's absolutely necessary, and we need increasing light within the church. But that's not really what Jesus' point is here. Jesus is referring to the fact that it's necessary for us to exhibit that light to the world. The world has to see the light. The world has to be drawn to something. It's the reason I keep reiterating this when I'm talking on this subject. I'll tell you two reasons why I keep reiterating this when I'm talking on this subject. One is because there has been a deeply embedded idea in the minds of some brethren among us that we are to be insulated, and we're to be introverted, and we're to be very secretive almost. They may not want to use that word or appreciate my using it, but be almost secretive when it comes to our teachings and our beliefs and our practices and things. That is not at all what you see in the Bible. But that's crept into the minds of some, that the idea is that we don't want to share the precious things we've been given. Let me ask you a question. Is there any possibility that if you shared your spiritual light, that would mean you would have less? Can somebody steal your spiritual light if you share it with them? No. We're using the word light, but let's get down to what's underneath some of it. If you have truth, and it's precious truth that is invaluable to you, is sharing it with somebody going to cause it to be lost? It'll just increase. Thank you, Sister Sharon. That's exactly right. You're not going to decrease in the truth by sharing it. The more you give it out, in fact, in my humble opinion, the more we do with the truths we have, both in our own lives and our sharing with others, the more God will give us. So the idea that we have to guard it and protect it because someone might take it and do what with it? If they take the truth and it really is the truth and they believe it's truth, the only thing that could happen is something good. Think how common sense that is. They could take it and abuse it, but the only way you could abuse it is if you change what it is that we're saying. If what I am teaching is truth, and somebody decides to take it and go teach it in their church somewhere, the more, the merrier. Please do. Because if it's truth and it's from God, it won't do anything but be productive. So I'm not afraid of somebody taking the truth that I have and spreading it. Back when a lot of the brethren were doing a lot of studying on creation science and the book of Genesis, I stumbled across one individual who had made a whole set of DVDs and classes on that subject that were very interesting. He was a very good teacher, very down-to-earth, very good sense of humor, kept your attention, especially for the younger generation. And his set of DVDs, there was 10 or 12 probably DVDs. And I think they asked about $100 for them, which for 10 or 12 DVDs is really reasonable. One of the things I really appreciated about this person, after I ordered them, he personally sent me a message and he said, I want you to know, we are not selling these for the sake of just making a profit. We asked something for them because we want to get our initial return on our investment back so we can pay to do more. He said, but we want you to make copies. We are not copywriting this. We want you to make as many copies as you can, give them to as many people as you can. I have seldom stumbled on people that have done that. In fact, some of the folks have bothered me a little bit on how protective they are of their materials going out. I'm not going to name their names, but I know some of you could figure this out. Some of the most prominent songwriters in Southern gospel music sometimes put out CDs and DVDs. And I'm going to tell you, they use some of the most expensive copy protection on them to make sure nobody can copy them. And that bothered me when I found that out. If what you're doing is for God and you want that music to reach people because you want to see people touched by the Spirit and saved, let them make all the copies they want. That's why most of the time when we put things out, if it's something that doesn't cost the church something, I'll let people have it for free if I can. And even with our books or other materials, if I know that somebody can't afford them, I always try to give things out free if we can do it. We do have to bring in some money because we have to pay for the materials and for the cost. But I think we ought to want the message, if we believe it's true, to go out as far as it can. We shouldn't be trying to restrain it, put a choke collar on the gospel message. That's ridiculous. I don't have a whole lot of quotes tonight, but there's a couple that I think are really good on this issue. And on this particular subject, as I was talking to Brother Chappell about here not long ago, though I do not agree with a lot of his doctrine in certain areas, John MacArthur does have some of the best devotional statements on this particular subject in his studies on the book of Matthew. And he does have a very good statement on the contrast between the different roles of salt and light. He said, whereas salt is hidden, light is obvious. Salt works secretly, while light works openly. Salt works from within, light from without. Salt is more the indirect influence of the gospel, while light is more its direct communication. Salt works primarily through our living, while light works primarily through what we teach and preach. Salt is largely negative. It can retard corruption, but it cannot change corruption into incorruption. Light is more positive. It not only reveals what's wrong and false, but helps produce what is righteous and true. And a little later in his commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, he says, by its nature and by definition, light must be visible in order to illuminate. Christians must be more than the largely indirect influence of salt. They must also be the direct and noticeable instruments of light. Both in the daytime and the night, a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. It is exposed for all to see. By day, its houses and buildings stand out on the landscape, and at night, the many lights shining out of its windows make it impossible to miss. A secret Christian is as incongruous as a hidden light. That's what I've been heavily emphasizing, not only in going through some of these types of statements in the Sermon on the Mount about salt and light, but I've been heavily emphasizing it just talking about the necessity of preaching the gospel and evangelism and us not being so cloistered in our approach. I'm going to finish his quote in a minute, but I said a moment ago that there were a couple of reasons why I felt that burden. One of them is that I see that there is a spirit of almost anti-evangelism that has existed among us that some are wanting to continue to foster, and that is a dangerous thing to do. The other thing is that when I got the terminal diagnosis of cancer that I got and was going through that struggle, I was ready to start backing up from teaching as much as I do. I was ready to start backing up from speaking as much as I do. I figured my time was very short. I wasn't thinking of new things to teach on. I wasn't trying to look for something to speak on. I was trying to wrap up things because I thought my life was coming to an end. I sat down one day and was praying and talking to the Lord about how I hoped He would give me enough time to wrap up some of the subjects that I had started. And I said, Lord, please let me wrap up some of these subjects. And I felt the strongest feeling that there were two things that He wanted me to teach on. Both of those things were not things I had been teaching on. I was trying to wrap up subjects, like I said. I wasn't trying to start new ones. In the midst of that was when Brother Moore asked me to preach on the Sermon on the Mount, right when he heard that I'd gotten that diagnosis. So I had that on my mind, and I'm thinking, how can I do that in a timely way? And will the Lord give me time? But right at the same time, right as I was at the peak of what I was dealing with stage 4 cancer condition I was in at the time, right at the peak of that is when the Lord spoke to me about two subjects. I don't know if I've told anybody this directly, this experience. I've hinted at it a few times if you're reading between the lines or listening. But the Lord made it clear to me that He wanted me to emphasize the necessity for preaching the gospel and not hiding the truth and being more transparent and open as a body of people to this world and not trying to be so closed. There's a lot of layers to that, but it was very forceful when I felt it from the Lord. I felt a heavy burden that He wanted me to emphasize how important it is for us to stop trying to do things in certain ways that sometimes are the methods of a past dispensation that we don't need to carry into the future. And one of those things is this idea about the truth being so precious, we have to keep it from people. As if you own it. It's your possession that you have to protect, make sure nobody can have it. It's not yours, it's God's. And God so loved the world. And Jesus is calling us the light of the world. The truth is supposed to go out to the world. And I felt such a terrible burning within me to preach that. There's one other subject that ties into this because of what I just said about some of the things in past dispensations that need to change. I felt a terrible burden as well to preach on the ministry and to talk about what the ministry is and what the ministry is not to be. And I imagine that it's possible when I was preaching on that, someone might think you've got to have 40 or 50 years, you've got to have many years of experience in the ministry before you could teach that subject. I'd been almost 20 years in the ministry before I was teaching it. I didn't just get into the ministry, decided to teach on the ministry. As I said, it was a tremendous burden. I didn't want to teach on that subject. I knew it would be controversial, but I felt the Lord said, this is what I want you to talk on. I honestly believed He wanted me to talk on it and then He was going to let me leave this world. I didn't think He was going to let me keep on. I thought, this is what He wants me to be my last things that I'm teaching on. Thank God I'm teaching on other things now and continuing to move forward, but that burden was heavy on my shoulders when He asked me to teach on that, and it was clear as day that He did, and He backed it up with many signs that He wanted me to teach on those subjects in particular. And they're necessary. But you don't have to have 50 years in the ministry to teach on the ministry. You just have to have enough experience in the ministry. Before I had hit 10 or 15 years in the ministry, I had already been working with a number of churches overseas and other things. So I had enough seasoning in terms of my experience. None of us have enough seasoning in terms of our knowledge and wisdom and understanding to teach on a subject that serious. But God will give you the experiences you need to have the answers that you need. And so that is the case. And another example, I had somebody say one time that nobody should be teaching on certain subjects until they are 30 or 40 years into the ministry. And I kind of got a kick out of that statement because you do understand Paul was teaching on some of the most intensive, heavy subjects that can be taught on just a few years into the ministry. A few years into the ministry, the Apostle Paul was teaching on some of the most touchy and difficult and deep subjects you could teach on. By the time Paul was in the ministry, as long as I have been right now, you realize he was nearing the end of his ministry? And had already taught on some of the heaviest subjects you could teach on. But those were two great burdens God put on my heart, which is why it's almost impossible when I'm on a subject like salt and light and other things not to keep hammering away at this point that it is so important we not become too insulated, that we're always reaching out and we never forget our responsibility to the lost and our responsibility to this dark world. We do have a responsibility. Let me go on with MacArthur's quote. I'm going to repeat his last statement. He said, a secret Christian is as incongruous as a hidden light. Lights are to illuminate, not to be hidden, to be displayed, not to be covered. Christians are to be both subtle salt and conspicuous light. God did not give the gospel of His Son to be the secret hidden treasure of a few, but to enlighten every person. Just read John 1:9. Many reject the light and reject those who bring it, but just as God offers His light to the whole world, so must His church. It is not our gospel, but God's. And He gives it to us not only for our own sakes, but for the entire world's. True believers are salt and light and must fulfill that identity. You notice when Jesus says that they're the light of the world, that's a description that we've heard Him use of Himself, didn't He? He is the light of the world. But it's interesting that He says, you are the light of the world, because if we're taking on Jesus' character and disposition, and if we're communicating His message, we will be the same light source that He is. I'll give you a few verses about Jesus being the light of the world. John 1:4-9 says, in Him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. He says, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. Who's the light for? The light of the world, and it lighteth who? People. It's interesting it words it this way, by the way. It says, every man that cometh into the world. That sounds strange. Where are they coming from? Well, that's just a very poetic way of saying every person that's been born into the world. Every human being born, that light is for. This is the problem that I keep hammering away at. I'm trying to crack the stony facade of some people's mentality about this. Not in our assemblies here, but in some places that have this idea about not sharing the truth, not putting messages out in public. I don't understand how you can possibly make those kind of statements if you've even barely read the New Testament. The messages in the New Testament are almost all in public places. Everywhere from synagogues where they were resistant to marketplaces, to theaters, to every public place you could find. But notice what he says at the end of this statement. Who is the light for? Every man that cometh into the world. That means being born into this world. Every man that's alive on the earth is who the light's for. It's not for every man that cometh into the church. You'll get light if you come into the church, if this is a place of light. But the light is for everybody that's out there in the world. John 8:12, then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. John 9:4-5 says, I must work the works of him that sent me. While it is day, the night cometh when no man can work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Now that's an interesting statement, because did the world just go dark when Jesus went back to the Father? He can still be in the world through us. He could be in the world personally, but he can also be in the world indirectly through us, if we are light bearers. John 12:46, he says, I am come a light into the world, that whosoever believeth in me should not abide in darkness. One of the other quotes I'll give you is from R. Kent Hughes, who is another one that I think tends to have some very good insights on this subject of the Sermon on the Mount. He's giving some of the background context of Jesus' declaration back in John 8:12 when he said, I'm the light of the world. It's really interesting what was going on when he made that statement, and it might give you a little bit more insight into what he even meant by it. He says, the story of how Jesus identified himself as the light of the world is remarkably beautiful and instructive. It happened on the day following the spectacular nighttime ceremony known as the illumination of the temple, which took place in the temple treasury before 4 massive golden candelabra that were topped with huge torches. It said that the candelabra were as tall as the highest walls of the temple, and that at the top of these candelabra were mounted great bowls that held 65 liters of oil. There was a ladder for each candelabrum, and when evening came, healthy young priests would carry oil up to the great bowls. You'd have to be a healthy young priest. You're going to climb a ladder all the way up there, by the way. And light the protruding wicks. Eyewitnesses said that the huge flames that leaped from those torches illuminated not only the temple, but all of Jerusalem. After the torches were roaring high above the people, the Mishnah tells us, men of piety and good works used to dance before them with burning torches in their hands, singing songs and praises, and countless Levites played on harps and lyres and cymbals and trumpets and instruments of music. This rite celebrated the great pillar of fire that led the people of Israel during their sojourn in the wilderness and spread its fiery billows over the tabernacle. It was in the temple treasury the following morning, with the charred torches still in place, that Jesus lifted his voice above the crowd and proclaimed, I am the light of the world. Whosoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. There could scarcely be a more emphatic way to announce one of the supreme truths of his existence. Christ was saying, in effect, the pillar of fire that came between you and the Egyptians, the cloud that guided you by day in the wilderness and illumined the night and enveloped the tabernacle, that was me. Jesus is the light of the world. He is everything suggested by the storied cloud of glory. Moreover, he's everything suggested by the glowing metaphor of light, and much more. That's one of those traditions that were not in the Bible. It wasn't something that God instructed them to do in the Scripture, to have that type of a ceremony. But that is one of the ceremonies that was held at the time of Jesus' life in the 1st century A.D., and how telling that after they lit up the whole city of Jerusalem with a picture of what they were symbolizing as the pillar of fire, he would then declare, after those lights went out, that he was the light. Bigger light than any of those great candelabras, but a light that would light the whole world. And that is what the church is to be. That's at the heart of what we're going to be talking about when we talk about these 3 verses. There's different aspects of it in these 3 verses. The candle under a bushel, the city set on a hill, how we're the light that's intended to shine outside of the church. But at the heart of it, it's our responsibility to be an example in our life and to be a communicator of the truth. The type of light that we are shining is, in part, the light that is seen in us in terms of our character and disposition, those things that people can see Christ in us. But you're going to see as we go through some of the statements that tie into this, that the communication of truth is also very deeply connected with light and the necessity for us to be truth bearers and light bearers both. In Jesus' statement here, he applies the title of light to his followers, pointing to the fact that they're to be bearers of the light. We're to be lights that shine in the darkness, and we're to be lights in the world, just as he is the light of the world. We don't become lights that are burning at full brightness, though, when our lamp is first lit, just like we don't become holy and entirely perfect at the moment of our conversion, or even at the point of Holy Spirit baptism. That light might burn as bright as it's ever burned in our lives at that point, but it doesn't burn at that level permanently from that point onward. We have to grow in light in terms of our knowledge and our understanding and wisdom, as well as in the light that is communicated through our life and example. Proverbs 4:18-19 is where it says, the path of the just is as a shining light, it shineth more and more unto the perfect day. I hear people quote that, and it's good to add the next verse because it gives you the other side of the coin. It's always best to get the whole context when you're looking at something like that. The next side of the verse is the opposite. It says, the way of the wicked is as darkness. They know not at what they stumble. They're stumbling over things all the time, and they either refuse to believe there's anything there that they're stumbling over, or they don't understand what it is they're stumbling over. But the path of the just is as a shining light that shineth more and more into the perfect day. That means the light that we have and the light that we're intended to exhibit to others is something that will increase over time. As we grow in the Lord, we should be brighter and brighter in terms of our spiritual illumination. We should be able to impact people in a deeper way. I have known people, and I imagine you have too. We have some in this assembly. We have some in every assembly, I hope. I know we have some here and in Green. My grandfather and Sister Chapel's grandfather was one of those who seems like the further his life expanded, the closer to God he got. Some people, you wonder if they just hit a place of stagnancy at some point, and they seem like they reach a certain level and they never go past that. Or God forbid, they get to the end of their life, and this is a terrible thing to end your life on. That's when they decide to start having kind of a nasty spirit and other things as they're getting older. God forbid, we want to grow sweeter as the days go by. We want to grow more filled with light as time goes on. So I've seen some people in my life that I've deeply appreciated, that as they got to the end of their life, they were probably as sweet as they'd ever been. Maybe sweeter than they'd ever been at the end of their life. They were more full of the light and life of God than they'd ever been. That's the goal. The goal for us is to grow in those areas as we go on with the Lord. It is a process, and so when Jesus is telling them they're the light of the world, He didn't mean that they were the fully shining, bright light of the world at that moment and they'd never have to increase anymore. It's a process, but it's also a promise that'll be completed if we remain in the process. All of God's promises for us will be brought to fruition. They'll be completed as long as we remain in the process. We have to stay in the process to receive the promise. So we want to be the light of the world. We've got to keep growing in that, just like that passage in Proverbs 4:18 says. And if we strive to remain just, says the path of the just man is a shining light. If we strive to remain just, which is, just another word for being righteous, in terms of our relationship with God, He'll continue to give us more light in regard to truth, in regard to direction. He'll continue to guide us in the way of righteousness. Tell us what next steps we need to make and to lead us to higher and holier ground in our relationship with Him. But it's not just individually that we can be effective as light bearers. In many ways, we're more effective corporately as light bearers than we even are individually. I'm going to quote MacArthur again. He says in both verses 13 and 14, the pronoun you is emphatic. The idea is you are the only salt of the earth. You are the only light of the world. When someone's talking about a pronoun that's emphatic in the Greek language, for example, they mean it is putting the emphasis on the person it's talking about as singular in a way that's different from everyone else. But this is a plural. So he's talking to the group and saying, you as a group are the only light. That would have to be true, wouldn't it? Because what other light would there be than God's people? He was talking to what was going to become the church, and he's saying, you're the light. That's yet another reason of my long list why it's so valuable to look at the original language. Because it really adds something to this. He didn't just casually saying, you're the light of the world. He's saying, if you look at the grammar, you are the light. There's no other. So if you're not doing your job in being the light, there won't be light. Remember what Jesus said? He said, as long as I'm in the world. He said some other statements where he said, look now, I'm in the world, and while I'm here and there's light, do everything you can. Let's get everything done we can while I'm here and there's light. But there's a subtle hint underneath that about two things that almost sound like they're contrasting one another. One is, he's going to be leaving. His light was going to be going out of the world, going back to the Father. But if they took up the torch of His light would still be present in the world. So when He's telling them, you are the light of the world, He's making a very emphatic statement. There's no other source. If you don't do this job, the world won't have light. That's why it bothers me so deeply when I hear people talking about keeping our teachings privatized, and not preaching the truth publicly and not giving out our truths to this world around us. You are going directly against the emphatic command of Jesus to be a light. The light has to go out to the world. If it isn't going out to the world, if the only light source there is the church, and the church boards up its windows and bars up its doors so no light can get out because it's too precious, and if you want to see the light, knock on the door, we'll unlock it for you, you can come in, we'll close it real quick. God forbid anyone out there would get a taste of the good things of God. God forbid anyone out there would hear some truth that might take them to the altar. Of course we're intended to do that. He goes on to say, the world's corruption will not be retarded and its darkness will not be illumined unless God's people are the salt and light. The very ones who are despised by the world and persecuted by the world are the world's only hope. The you in both verses is also plural. It is His whole body, the church, that's called to be the world's salt and light. Each grain of salt has its limited influence, but it is only as the church collectively is scattered in the world that change will come. One ray of light will accomplish little, but when joined with other rays, a great light is created. Which comes back to my point about how much more of an impact we can have corporately. We individually can have a powerful impact if God is using us to be a light to this world or salt to this world. But the more of us that do it, the more impact we'll have. The more of the churches working together. That's true in any level of the operation of the church, whether it's things we're doing within the church in our services and other things, or things the church is doing as arms of its outreach and external activities. The more that we do as a group and the more the group is involved, the more impact we can have and the more that we can get accomplished. Which is why it's so important for as many people as possible to be engaged in whatever is going on at church. I've been saying this a lot at Green lately too. Because we have services in Green where we might have a couple of hundred people out in service now. But that doesn't mean every service is that way. We need in every service, saints, here in Mansfield and Green and any place where God is working. We want everybody possible to be out for everything possible. Because the more people are out, the more impact we can have in the activity of the church. And the more God's attention will be drawn. Doesn't mean He can't come into the home of one single person on their knees praying or just a handful of people in a building. But He does respond in a powerful way to more and more people turning to Him in a corporate sense. So Jesus isn't just referring to light shining into the church. He's calling for the church to enlighten the dark world around it. Jesus was a light that came into the world, and we have to be a light that comes into the world. Though everybody didn't see that light, you read some of the statements in the first chapter of John. Some of them looked right at Jesus and didn't see the light. They didn't understand at all what was going on because they were in darkness. Though maybe they didn't all see that light, it wasn't because it was hidden from them in some kind of a separated, sealed-away storehouse that they just couldn't get to because God didn't want them to see it. If they didn't see His light, it wasn't because it wasn't open. It wasn't because it wasn't revealed to them. It wasn't because it wasn't right in front of them. It was because they were blind to it, and sometimes willfully blind, because they did not want to accept what the light would lead them to have to change on. That's one of the great challenges we always will have, is that God is in an almost constant business of making changes. He's always making changes. Until He gets to a perfect state in every different area that He's working on, He's constantly making changes, and changes are always resisted. People don't like change. I don't really like change. I'd like things to be still and calm and not have to constantly adapt to different things, but that is not the world we live in. And that is not the process that we're in to get us to perfection. We'll have to keep going through changes individually and corporately until we become the kind of light that God can use. And then I'm going to keep repeating and keep repeating and keep repeating. That light is for the world. Yes, it helps us in the church to have the light burning bright here, but it is not for the sake of the church that God lit this light. It's for the sake of turning the world into the church. You understand? He wants those inside the walls of the church to grow into their full maturity, but He also wants to bring more people into the church. So like a lighthouse in the midst of a dark sea, the church is intended to shine out into the world. If a church isn't shining out across the dark waters of the spiritual sea of mankind, both in its open example of its spirit and character of Christ, in other words, as people look at Jesus in your life and they see what kind of person you are, and I hope this would not make anyone uncomfortable in this building tonight, but unless we are really where we ought to be, it's going to make you uncomfortable. People should be drawn to your church by seeing and hearing and interacting with you outside of church. And I don't mean because you preach the gospel to them. That might be a good idea. But I mean, your spirit should be so like the Spirit of Christ. Your temperament should be so in tune with His that somebody around you would want to find out where you go to church. They'd say, there's something special about that Brother Kosa. I get around, they may not call you Brother Kosa if they're not going to church, but there's something special about that Kosa guy. I get around him and I just feel so good. There's something sweet there. There's something there that I don't feel around other people that don't go to church. And I know he goes to church. I know he loves the Lord. Maybe it's his love for the Lord and His church that have changed him to make him this kind of person. And then better yet, they encounter somebody else from the assembly. They run into Brother Lee. Like, my Lord, Brother Lee, there's something so special about him. It makes me want to find out, what kind of God does he serve? What kind of beliefs does he have? What kind of church does he go to? That it's changed his life this way, that his faith has so impacted his life, that his spirit is this kind of spirit. That's why it's so important that we live out our faith, because if you're out in the world acting like the world, there's nothing that you're showing them that would want them to ever desire to come to your church. We've got to have something the world doesn't have. That is part of us being a light, that by our good works, Jesus said. So I have heard some people try to escape the other conclusions I'm coming to about the necessity for the light going out in terms of preaching and teaching. They'll say, no, Brother Bear, we're not supposed to be preaching and teaching in these public ways. That's just talking about setting a good example for the world so they see that you are a good moral person, have a good spirit. I'm sorry to tell you this, but there are moral people out there who don't even have the Christian faith. You could run into people that have a wonderful disposition, but that isn't even created by the Christian faith. They just have a sweet type of a spirit. Or maybe they're a very moral person. That is not the only thing that sets us apart. It's what we believe that sets us apart as well. And that's critical. But you can't make the argument that these type of statements about us being salt and light are just talking about us being a good example in our community or having a good disposition. That's important. I just told you how important it is. But you cannot erase the fact that many times the type of light that the Lord is talking about going out is the light of truth. And as I said, I'm going to give you examples from other verses that back that fact up. If a church isn't shining out, as I said, across the dark waters of the spiritual sea of mankind, both in its example of the Spirit of Christ, that people see the church members and say, look at that, there's something different about those people, but also in its open proclamation of the truth as a clarion call to the world to come to Christ, they're not a lighthouse. I've known some haughty and arrogant individuals who think of their churches as great high places and tall towers and lighthouses. They even refer to their churches at times as lighthouses and towers, when the only height and light that they exhibit is in their own self-estimation of their role in the body of Christ, because there's nothing shining out of them to the world. All that attention they're drawing to themselves is just attention inside the body. Look at us, this great tower you should look to as a template for the body. The tower is so the world can see it. It's not so everyone in the body can look to one church in the body and say, there's the one we all need to follow. The body has got to get to the place where all of the churches are operating in the right way, in the right order and operation, with the right doctrine. But there is no one single church in the body that every single other church has to map itself out after and look exactly like and sound exactly like and act exactly like, any more than there's any one minister. It's one of the things that can creep up on you unawares, you know, and it isn't a bad thing if it does, where you can sit under a minister so long, especially if you're a man sitting under a minister, whether you're a brother in a church sitting under a pastor or whether you're a minister sitting under another minister who is in a higher position of authority. You can, after a while, start to take on some of their qualities. You can take on their gestures. There's things I probably still do now. After 20 years in the ministry, there are things I probably still do that I picked up what must have been 25 or 30 years ago, being around Brother Moore for years. We pick up things. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's important to make a distinction between imitation, so to speak, being the sincerest form of flattery, in that you're doing it unconsciously, versus consciously assuming that one person is the ideal that you have to shape your life to. There's only one person that is that ideal. I think I heard someone just say it. Jesus, Brother Hannawalt. That's the only ideal. Even Paul was humble enough to say, as mighty of a man of God as Paul was, he was humble enough to say, follow me as I follow Christ. Even Paul didn't just say, follow me. He probably could have, because he was leading in the right direction. But even Paul didn't just say, follow me. There is no man that ought to be made into an idol, and there is no church that should be made into an idol. I mean one individual assembly. That everybody else has to be like that church, and if you're not like them, you're not as good as they are. Different churches serve different purposes, and there's not a single church in this body that is doing everything a church is intended to do yet. That might be a hard statement to say, but there are some churches that are far more evangelistic. There's some churches that are far more teaching-oriented. Some churches that are far more skilled at discipleship and mentoring, training ministers. There is no one church, though, that is such a lighthouse that anybody that wants to figure out how to do anything right needs to look at that church. It's not Mansfield. It's not Green. There are qualities in these churches that I think are stellar qualities that I love and cherish, that I pray we can keep building on, and I pray we can keep adding other things to our churches to make them stronger in any area they're weak. But there isn't a church that's the lighthouse. We are a lighthouse, and we've got to be a lighthouse in the right way if we're going to be a lighthouse. And as I said, some of the churches that seem to think of themselves as great towers and lighthouses, if you're actually looking at the work of what a lighthouse does, aren't lighthouses at all, because some of those places are places that are determined to keep their messages secret and to make sure nothing goes out that's public. You just entirely redefined who you are from being a lighthouse if that's your mentality. When a church refuses to allow the light of its preaching and teaching to shine out over this dark sea of mankind I've been talking about, and to be clearly visible to those outside the walls of the lighthouse, it isn't a lighthouse. What's the purpose of a lighthouse? Is that big light up in the top of there? You know, different types of lights have been used at different times in history. Sometimes it was literally a big bonfire up in there with mirrors. But is that giant light in there now that in most lighthouses is a turning light that's like a giant spotlight that rotates? Is that giant light intended to light up the inside of the house so you can see what you're doing downstairs? That light isn't even for the inside of the house. It's so that those far out on the sea can see that light from a great distance and be drawn to the light. Now, not in the sense that we think of it spiritually, because if you keep going towards the lighthouse, you're going to get yourself in serious trouble. You're going to run into the lighthouse or the island or the edge of the shore that it's on. But in a spiritual sense, the light from the lighthouse draws us to the lighthouse. But the light from the lighthouse that's shining out isn't light for the inhabitants of the lighthouse. It's light for people that are outside the lighthouse so they can find it. The people are out there when they see the light. They don't have to come into the house to see the light. We shine it out to them. So no matter how much light is within the house, in terms of the lighthouse, if that light is prohibited from shining out into the world, in the sense of us sharing the truth with those outside the church, any church prohibiting that isn't a lighthouse at all. That's simple enough, isn't it? I realize it's blunt, and I realize that there are some among us who are so adamantly opposed to openly preaching the truth, which, just listen to the words I just said. Adamantly opposed to openly preaching and teaching the truth. Does that even sound like it could be something that's Christian? See, we get caught up in ideas that then corrupt our thinking, and then we come to these conclusions where all you have to do is just say what it is, and anybody in their right mind is going to be a little shocked by it. You are adamantly opposed to openly preaching and teaching the truth. Who in their right mind would want to be included in that accusation? And that is what I told you in the midst of what I was going through was one of the things the Lord put a great burden on my heart. I didn't have any great pressure within me personally that I felt I needed to talk about the necessity to preach the gospel and do it openly and publicly and stop hiding things away in some kind of a hoarder mentality. The Lord started to speak to my heart, and I felt like I could not get off that subject. I still to this day keep coming back to it and reiterating it. Lighthouses are not built for the benefit of those living on the land that they're built on. They stand tall and shine out brightly for the sake of those that are out on the sea who don't have light. That's what they're for. And a church that's the light of the world has to actually shine their light out into the world. Such a church will openly proclaim the truth and share the life-giving light of the full gospel to a world that will die if they do not receive it. We need to realize this world's in danger of death, and we have the sustenance that could save them, but we aren't going to share it with them unless they come to us and beg for it. Is that at all what you see Jesus doing? Is that at all what you see Jesus commanding? Is that at all what you see Jesus' church doing? Did Paul settle down after he received the truth that he received on the Damascus Road and through those years that the Lord set him aside and was training his mind out in the desert and other places? Did he just sit down somewhere and settle and never move again and say, if anybody wants to get the great truths God's given me, they'll send them to my church? Maybe I'll start a church in Damascus, since that's where I'm from, So we'll start a Damascene church, a Damascus church. If God wants people to get the great truths He's given me, I'm speaking for Paul, He'll send them to Damascus or Antioch or wherever it is that is my place where I'm at. Is that at all what you see?
No, it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. Generally, God sends the message out. The light has to go out. That's why I keep reiterating this idea of the lighthouse. The light has to go out, and then someone sees it and says, where is that coming from? And they follow the trail of the light, so to speak, back to its source. And then they come into the church. You come into church because you've seen the light. You might have seen it in the life of an individual, like I said, which is absolutely critical, is that we be light bearers in terms of our moral lives, our character, our disposition, as I said. But you've got to see and hear it in the message as well. It is entirely oppositional to the central call of sharing the hope of salvation to the world, to hide that hope and expect them to come and find it. Most of the world isn't looking for it. Most of the world is happy in their carnality. Oh, there's a hole in their heart. But I'm going to tell you right now, if the church was not salt and light, most of this world would never go looking for God. They'd fill that hole with other things. Just look around you. I don't mean in this building tonight. I mean outside this building, in this city tonight, in this world around us. Most of this world, if there wasn't something getting their attention to tell them there is something better, would just find whatever it is would give them happiness in this short span of life, and they would just indulge in it to the point of killing themselves, literally and spiritually, and would never go seeking God, most of them. The reason they go seeking God, if they do, is because they've seen or heard something that makes them want to hear or see more. So we have to be the ones that they see it in. There's the example we set. And the ones they hear it from, there's the message we preach. We have to be those things of this world. God help us so we don't hide that hope in the truths that lead to that hope behind guarded walls and make prohibitions against sharing it with the very people who need to hear it the most.